Hello everybody, it's very good to see you all here this evening. Jointly with the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Queensland, we are hosting a launch tonight of Climate Politics in Oceania, Renewing Australian Pacific Relations in a Warming World, which has been published by Melbourne University Press late last year. The book brings together diverse Australian and Pacific Island voices and perspectives, the contributors aiming to emphasise the need for Australia to engage constructively with regional partners on climate policy. Copies of the book are available here tonight at the special price of $35. Our launch is to be addressed by Dr Wesley Morgan, co-editor of Climate Politics in Oceania, with Professor Byrne and Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer of Griffith University. Dr Morgan is a senior researcher at the Climate Council, which was created after the former Climate Commission was demolished by the Abbott government in 2013. Dr Morgan is also a research fellow at the Griffith Asia Institute and has over a decade's experience in the Pacific Islands with Oxfam and at the University of the South Pacific. At the Climate Council, his research considers the impacts of climate change on Australia and our region and the international context for Australian climate policy. But he's going to tell you much more than that, so I'm handing over to you, Dr Morgan.
Thank you so much, Ian, and lovely to see you all this evening, and lovely to have a chance to share our book that I'll give you a bit of a tale as to how the book came into the world, what we were attempting to do by bringing together academics and scholars in Australia and the Pacific to think about climate change and what it means for relations in the region. And then I'll do a bit of a deep dive into the chapter that I author in the book with colleagues Dr George Carter and Faluri Manoa. And in Brisbane, my colleagues Sue and Caitlin will be doing the same. They'll be explaining where the book came from and then a deep dive into their chapters. So, where does it come from? So we were actually inspired by an issue of the Foreign Affairs magazine, journal, the American foreign policy magazine that's been around for a century or so. But in 2020, they had a special issue focused on climate change and foreign policy, and with some pretty big hitters writing about, how can the US leverage US state power to drive global efforts to tackle climate change. And it led with, the fire next time was actually referring to fires in Australia that had happened in early 2020. You'll recall here in Sydney that was, bright red in the sky and hard. But we, the collective we, were asking, where are we doing the thinking in Australia about foreign policy and climate change? Where are we doing the thinking about how Australia pursues its interests in a warming world? Where are we doing the thinking about that's kind of similar to the thinking that had gone into the essays in that magazine, and that the book is the result of that. But that's what we did was we brought together interested academics who were already thinking and writing about climate change and foreign policy, climate change and diplomacy, climate change and national security, and it was, to be honest, it was a somewhat drawn out and torturous process from that writer's workshop to the book. So, but hopefully it contributes. I think we need to do a lot more deep thinking about how we pursue our interests in a warming world, and hopefully this contributes to the discussion. So the Writers' Workshop was convened with my colleagues at Griffith University, Professor Byrne, Professor Sue Harris-Rimmer, And we together, it wasn't super torturous. They were wonderful co-authors. And so the climate crisis is necessarily changing our approach to foreign policy and diplomacy. Our conceptions of defence and national security are being challenged by the climate crisis. Our partnerships with key allies, increasingly our allies like the United States, Australia and the US, last year, Biden was supposed to be addressing a joint sitting of Parliament in Canberra, but was diverted at the last minute because of the crisis in funding in Congress. But nevertheless, we announced that climate action is now a pillar of the Australia-US alliance. Our relations in Asia-Pacific, our exports to key trading partners, all aspects of international relations are being reshaped by climate change and by the clean energy transition. And we're not doing enough thinking about what that means. And this book doesn't pretend that this is all the thinking about what that means, but it's in that field, in that area, that it contributes to the discussion. So what does the book cover? And what I'll do is I'll give a quick rundown of literally what each chapter covers, so that you have a sense, because it's a bit of that you have a sense of what we tried to capture. So we start with a special foreword from Dame Meg Taylor, who was the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, who gives a special foreword explaining climate change as the key threat facing the Pacific region. We have an overview of the science, understanding possible futures for Australia and the Pacific, depending on what action we take to tackle climate change now. So that's kind of the grounding in which we subsequently think about what that means from a range of disciplinary perspectives. Caitlin Byrne, with colleagues at Griffith University, Johanna Nalau, Andrea Huffner, they have a chapter that's a history of the role of the Australian Ambassador for the Environment, which is at the moment the Australian Ambassador for Climate, Australian Climate Ambassador, Kristen Tilley. And I think it's really fascinating. It explains that unique role in Australian diplomacy, not representing Australia in multilateral discussions on climate. Then we have my chapter with George Carter and Filori Manoa, looking at Pacific Island leadership in multilateral climate negotiations, and also looking at the troubled relationship between Australia and Pacific Islands on climate. We have a chapter from Tess Newton-Kane, Ramitesh Kant, Melody and Caitlin Byrne, looking at the relationship between China and Pacific Island countries through the prism of climate change. So how does climate change and climate action influence the relationship? We have a chapter from the sadly late Brendan Sargent. Brendan was the director of, I better get it right, at ANU, Professor of Practice in Defence and Strategic Studies and Head of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU. And so Brendan and Mark Beeson, they both have these kind of chapters that are a couplet that really try to grapple with the idea that climate change is a threat to Australia's national security. So, we have a strategic culture in Australia that is focused on a particular type of threat, that is a transnational threat that comes across the border, kinetic warfare or terrorism. But climate change is not in that same conceptual field. So they want to grapple with the idea that climate change in itself is a threat to Australians' national security, but also more broadly that the impacts of climate change, the flow-on effects, and what that means for our relationship with the US, our relationship with Pacific Island countries. So I think, really excellent contributions to the discussion from those thinkers that we're not seeing enough of in other places. Melissa Connolly-Tyler, who a previous executive director of the Australian Institute for International Affairs, has a chapter thinking about a climate agenda for Australia's engagement with the Pacific, looking through the lens of the 3 Ds, development, diplomacy and defence engagement. Professor Sandra Tart at the University of the South Pacific in Fiji, she talks about reconciling competing security narratives in the Pacific, with one being concerned about geostrategic competition and China's presence in the Pacific, and one being more concerned about human security and environmental security. And then, apologies for the list, but I wanted to give you a sense of the breadth that's in the book. There's the last 2 chapters look at climate change and international law, looking at what climate change means for sea level rise and the exclusive economic zones of Pacific Island countries. How do they persist or not as climate change sees sea level rise? And then Sue Harris-Rimmer rounds it out with thinking about international human rights law and climate change. If you're still with me, I want to give a bit of a deep dive just into one of the chapters, which is the chapter that I've authored with George Carter and Filori Manoa. And it's based on, so George did his doctorate on Pacific Island countries in global climate negotiations. I did my doctorate on Pacific Island countries in global trade negotiations. Filori did her master's on Pacific Islands at the UN in New York. And so the 3 of us brought that field research together for thinking about Pacific Island countries in global climate negotiations. But before we get to that part, I want to introduce you to the Blue Pacific, Pacific Island nations. So in the Pacific, there are 14 independent island countries, and in Australia we're used to thinking about these island countries as small and remote islands out in a vast sea. But in the Pacific, so this is the Tongan philosopher Apeli Hauofa, and he's a bit of a seminal thinker in the Pacific, and he talks about, while continental men have tended to see only small islands in a far sea, Pacific peoples in fact live in a vast and interconnected sea of islands. And the distinction is, it sounds small, but it's quite profound. Before Europeans arrived in this part of the world, Pacific Island peoples had been cut off from continents for centuries, but had developed an oceanic culture that was joined, as wayfarers, navigators, shared languages, shared cultures, so very different languages, but shared cultures across the region. And this sense of being an oceanic peoples has informed the post-colonial identity of the Pacific and the contemporary norms of Pacific diplomacy as a connected region. And as recently as 2022, the Pacific countries agreed to work together with a 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific. But I want to give you a sense that this is what the Blue Pacific is. It's not small and isolated islands. It's a connected region of collective diplomacy guided by pre-colonial and post-colonial norms. So Pacific Island countries meet, Pacific leaders meet every year for the Pacific Islands Forum. The Australian Prime Minister goes as well. And the Pacific, in recent times, they've had this idea that our work together, a long-term foreign policy commitment to act as one blue continent. I mean, that in itself I think is fascinating. But, and I can only skim over the top. But the point is that in the post-independence period, in the 70s and 80s, Pacific Island countries were not without power in shaping global cooperation. When they worked together as a bloc, so through collective diplomacy, Pacific Island nations have a significant number of votes at the United Nations, And so during the negotiations, for example, of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, Pacific Island countries found legal expression for this somewhat poetic idea of being large ocean states rather than small island states. So advocating for exclusive economic zones that extend 200 nautical miles, 200, 300, 200, out from their territories. And, you know, major powers, including the United States, for example, was not a fan of that, of those exclusive economic zones. But the Pacific was part of, you know, it was Pacific diplomats in New York that helped to secure UNCLOS and the exclusive economic zones. I won't go through all of the examples, but, you know, the Rarotonga Treaty, the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty was negotiated as a collective. And then we had something of a resurgence in more recent times of collective diplomacy by Pacific Island countries. And the link is that understanding that about how the Pacific works helps you to understand how the Pacific engaged with the issue of climate change. So in the late 1980s, we saw, or mid to late 1980s, we had a global consensus on, scientific consensus on climate change. And the Pacific, you know, there was the first regional scientific assessment by the South Pacific Regional Environment Program, assessed what climate change and sea level rise would mean for Pacific Island countries. And here we have in 1989, you know, the results of that report were in the Pacific Islands media. Say goodbye to low-lying island nations in the Pacific. So there was immediately a concern that climate change presented an existential threat to particularly atoll islands in the Pacific. But there are small islands in the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean as well. And in the late 1980s, there was a meeting in the Maldives that brought together nations from the Pacific, the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean. And out of that meeting emerged the Alliance of Small Island States, AIOSIS. And the point of this story is that AIOSIS then played a significant role in the global discussion about how you tackle climate change. Pacific Island countries, through that model of collective diplomacy and the annual Pacific Island Forum declarations, said very early on that climate change threatens the economic and physical survival of Pacific Island nations and calls for a global treaty with binding obligations to reduce emissions. At this time, Australia was roughly aligned with the Pacific. So in the late 1980s, Australia was putting forward proposals for targets to cut emissions that were world-leading targets. Australia actually funded Pacific Island countries, funded the meeting in the Maldives that led to the formation of the Alliance of Small Island States. You know, our foreign minister at the time, Gareth Evans, he personally felt that, you know, climate change was an existential threat, a global threat that we needed to take very seriously. And so there was an alignment between Australia and the Pacific. That was to change in the mid-1990s. But just before we get there, the global response to climate change was the establishment of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, which all countries agreed they would work together to stabilise the global climate to prevent dangerous anthropogenic, I can't remember the exact wording, but they agreed to work together to tackle climate change, but it was a non-binding framework convention that you would subsequently negotiate treaty protocols under. The Pacific, through AIOSIS, was very engaged in those discussions for the UNFCCC, and the UNFCCC Secretariat actually has special roles for small island states. The Pacific put forward the first draft of a global treaty that would actually see countries required to reduce emissions. So they put forward a proposal for an AIOSIS protocol in 1997 when the discussions in Kyoto, because you've got the UNFCCC, it doesn't actually require countries to reduce emissions. We need a protocol that does. The Pacific put that forward. It went through the sausage-making process of the multilateral treaty negotiations, so it didn't come out the same, but the AIIA protocol set the terms for the discussion and meant Kyoto was perhaps more ambitious than it would have otherwise have been. In the lead up to Kyoto, though, Australia had revisited its interests with regard to climate change. We had the election of John Howard here, and Australia essentially said, if the globe takes action to tackle climate change, we, as a major fossil fuel exporter and an economy that's a major coal producer, we will be impacted more than other advanced economies. And so there was this sense that Australia ought to seek to carve out exemptions as much as possible, avoid obligations to reduce emissions as much as possible. And this led to clashes at the Pacific Islands Forum. So when they tried to have a regional collective position to take to Kyoto, John Howard refused to sign up to it, and that raised the ire of Pacific Island governments that said, look, you're not, that model of collective diplomacy, Australia stuck out like a sore thumb, and has ever since, is part of the story here. I've got too many slides, so I'm going to have to skip through some things, but after the Kyoto Protocol, global action on climate change stalled. The US withdrew from Kyoto. Australia did not sign up to Kyoto, despite the fact that we'd got a carve-out that meant we didn't have to do much. Not until 2007 did Australia join. The Pacific during this period didn't rest on their laurels, or not laurels, continued to press for global action through multilateral processes like the UN Security Council. The Pacific took climate change to the UN Security Council, saying climate change is a threat to our territorial integrity and sovereignty. And, at the time, the Pacific was kind of, the US kind of laughed at them and said, oh, look, we have this UN negotiations on climate change at the UNFCCC, you're not going to get far at the UN Security Council. But today, to skip forward a long way, Nauru and Germany co-chair a Friends of Climate and Security at the UN Security Council, and the US is a member of that group. So the world has shifted a lot since then. But the Pacific really led that discussion, saying, look, for us, climate change is no less serious than the threats that other nations face from guns and bombs. Copenhagen, in a nutshell, we saw similar to what happened before Kyoto. So in 2009, the world was to negotiate the post-Kyoto Global Climate Treaty. And Kevin Rudd was very invested personally in that global treaty, went off to Copenhagen, wanted to see it happen. There was a Pacific Islands Forum meeting in Cairns that year when the forum leaders all agreed to what they would take to Copenhagen. And they took this position that they wanted to see a global agreement to limit warming to 2 degrees and cut global emissions by 50% by 2050. The trouble was that the Pacific Island countries already had their own position through AIIA that they wanted to limit warming to 1.5 degrees and see emissions cut by 85% by 2050. So there was this, it was fascinating that the Pacific signed up to Australia's position there, but when they went to Copenhagen, there was a split again. Copenhagen fell apart. I won't go into the details as to why. Essentially, the global north and the global south remained too far apart as to who was responsible for climate change, who should take action first, etc., etc. In the aftermath of Copenhagen, the momentum was to, okay, look, we need a global agreement where all countries will take action to reduce emissions. And so there was a change in the way they thought about a global treaty. And there's China and the US, the world's biggest carbon emitters by this time, were saying, let's have a bottom-up approach where countries can set their own targets to reduce emissions. And this made it more possible to achieve a multilateral agreement. And so in Paris, we had The first ever global agreement actually requires countries to reduce emissions and limits warming to well below 2 degrees. The Pacific played a very large role in securing the Paris Agreement, and it's not particularly well known, but Tony de Bruyn, who was the Foreign Minister for the Marshall Islands, after 2009 and in the lead up to 2015, stitched together a coalition of countries from the global north and the global south, and they did this quietly and carefully. The ambitious countries met in the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, had their meetings with pen and paper. They didn't want to be spied upon. It wasn't a public process, and carefully stitched together a coalition so that, and in Paris, this coalition grew. It became the high ambition coalition. The Pacific came on board, African nations came on board, Caribbean nations came on board, and before you knew it, you had 100 plus countries. The European Union came on board, the US came on board, and you had finally what you needed. That north-south split that had bedeviled global cooperation was overcome, and you had a global agreement. And here is Tony de Bruyn walking down the plenary in Paris to get the agreement gavelled, and he's wearing a little bit of pandanus leaf on his, a little bit of palm or pandanus on his lapel. And this is Todd Stern, the US ambassador, wearing the same thing. And that represents being a member of the High Ambition Coalition, if you had that on your lapel. And so the Pacific played a really critical role achieving the Paris Agreement. Australia, on the other hand, in the lead up to Paris, there was the Pacific Islands Forum, and by now you know the formula. The Pacific countries and Australia had divergent positions going to Paris. Tony Abbott was saying, no, we won't have a global agreement that limits warming to 1.5 degrees. Pacific leaders were by then saying, look, Australia should leave the forum if they're not going to back us on this existential issue for us. And so there was tensions. And then when they went to Paris, the Australian Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, was not aware of the High Ambition Coalition until they announced themselves in Paris. And then Australia tried to join. This is Julie Bishop in Paris talking to Tony de Bruyn, and he said to the media, we're very interested to hear about Australia wanting to join, but Australia will need to put more ambition on the table to join. I'm going a little bit over time, but I hope you'll bear with me. I haven't got too long. So, under-recognised in Australia how important the Pacific was for achieving the global climate treaty that we have, the Paris Agreement. Since 2015, Australia became more concerned about the Pacific for other reasons. So Australia has this long-standing concern to be strategy of strategic denial in the Pacific, to be the regional hegemon, to keep out other powers that may have different interests to Australia. And in the past decade, this long-standing impetus in Australian foreign policy in the region was aroused by China's growing presence in the Pacific, and in response, Australia in 2017 launched a Pacific Step Up. This is actually Scott Morrison at the launch of the Pacific Step Up at the barracks in Townsville, which was an interesting place to choose to launch it, that seeks explicitly to integrate Pacific Island countries into Australia's security and economic institutions. These two quotes, at the end of the First World War, the Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes at the time talking about why Australia should administer New Guinea, talking about the Pacific Island countries. They encompass Australia, they're really important to Australia for security reasons. Hugh White, a century later, let's be honest, Australians haven't had that much time for our Pacific neighbours. Only their strategic significance has attracted us. The islands scattered widely across the north of our continent are critical to our protection from armed attack. Sounds a bit brutal, but I think that assessment is true, that Australia, at the end of the day, sees the Pacific through this lens of the region's strategic importance to Australia, and that shapes Australia's relative interest in the Pacific and how Australia engages with the Pacific. For Pacific Island countries, however, as we've been discussing, they had been telling the world for decades that climate change was their key security threat. So in 2018, at the Pacific Islands Forum, they issued a regional declaration on security which reaffirmed that climate change is the single greatest threat to the region. And, you know, we had Pacific military leaders saying, yes, there's geostrategic competition in the region, but there's three competing. There's the US, there's China, and there's climate change. And of the three, we're most concerned about climate change. And then we had the Tuvalu Prime Minister. We can't be regional partners under this Australian step-up unless the government of Australia takes a more aggressive response to climate change. And I don't know if people recall Scott Morrison in Tuvalu at the Pacific Islands Forum in 2019. They had a much bruising leaders meeting that year. You know, it was supposed to be 2 or 3 hours. It ended up going for 12 hours. And when they came out, you know, the accounts are that the Tongan Prime Minister was moved to tears by the discussion. It was a robust discussion. And when they came out, the Fiji Prime Minister, the bombastic Bainimarama, he said that, look, we're better off dealing with China than we are with Australia. The tensions on Australia's unwillingness to take action on climate change impacted on Australia's pursuit of its strategic interests in the region, including through its Pacific step-up. The moment we're in, finally, getting us to where we are. The election of a Labor government in 2022 saw Australia return to the fold in international climate action. At a rhetorical level, Australia's national interests are now tied to our transition to a renewables superpower. And Australia is explicitly seeking a rapprochement with Pacific Island countries and is very aware that climate change and Australia's acting on climate change and Australia's pursuit of strategic interests in the Pacific are things that need to happen together. So immediately after being elected, 4 days after, Foreign Minister Penny Wong was in Suva in Fiji explaining to the Pacific that the Pacific have been leaders in global climate action for decades, and Australia has let the region down, but that Australia would now stand shoulder to shoulder with the Pacific to tackle climate change. Her language. Australia also said, we will bid to co-host the UN climate talks in Australia in 2026. And last year, Prime Minister Albanese signed a Falapeli Union security deal with Tuvalu, which I haven't got time to unpack here, but essentially that Australia would take migrants from Tuvalu over time, and in return would be involved in any discussion about Tuvalu's pursuit of security arrangements with other powers. So that's where we are now, that our Climate Minister, Chris Bowen, we, along with Pacific nations, are seeking to host the UN climate talks in 2026. Pacific voices have led this debate for decades. We know that across our region we are already learning what happens if the world does not act, for island communities fighting over their existence, for us here in Sydney and Australia, battling over more frequent bushfires and floods, and by co-hosting the UN climate talks together, we can accelerate global action and harness the economic opportunities. So, in summary, for more than 3 decades, Pacific diplomats and leaders have shaped global cooperation on climate change. They were particularly influential at key moments: the UNFCCC in 1992, the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, landing the Paris Agreement in 2015, Pacific also led the global discussion on climate at the UN Security Council. Australia, by contrast, pursued a very different approach, and this has led to occasional tensions with the Pacific, particularly around those key moments, and has complicated Australian pursuit of Australia's strategic interests in the region. Where we are right now is there is an opportunity to reset relations, but it would require Australia to conceive its interests in similar ways to what Pacific Island countries do. So to begin to understand climate change as a pressing security threat for Australia and for Pacific Island countries, and that multilateral cooperation to move away from coal, oil and gas is what is key to tackling that threat. And if Australia's interests shift genuinely towards becoming a renewable superpower, there is the possibility of resetting relations with Pacific Island countries.
A long and winding road.
Yes.
We now have not quite half an hour for questions, so please start the ball rolling. Please stand up and wait for the microphone to arrive.
I've always had a big mouth, so I always ask questions. Two things. One, clearly rising sea levels is a major concern for the Pacific Island nations. Absolutely. You'd be a fool not to realise that. Is there a quantifiable measure of how much the sea levels have risen since 2000 to 2024? Can someone tell me 10 centimetres, 15, 6? Is there a number?
There are numbers, yes.
And what is it?
So it's with the, there's been a number of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. They bring together the global scientific consensus around climate change. So they synthesise literally thousands of scientific papers so that we have a distilled version of the science. And there have been special issues on oceans, special issues on 1.5 degrees of warming, and the latest assessment report, all of which, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but all of which have sections on the history of sea level rise and projections for sea level rise.
Okay. I think those numbers should be on the forefront of everyone's forehead, right? If we know it's gone up 1 inch, 2 inches, 3 inches in the last 25 years, we can see it going up. And if everyone talks about it, but no one gives you numbers, and people aren't fools, they just want to know what's happening. Second thing, I believe a lot of the Pacific Island nations use diesel to generate electricity in their islands. How, or what are they going to move to which will be a low carbon emitting source of electricity? And I don't know the answer to that either.
Yes, so on that one, the same thing that we're all going to move to, which will be, we'll all be moving away from coal, oil and gas, and primarily towards technologies like wind, solar, storage. We have the technologies now to replace diesel generation. You're absolutely right that diesel generation is how power is generated in a lot of Pacific Islands, but increasingly so too is solar panels. For really remote parts of Vanuatu and the Solomons, you have thatch roof villages, but people can whack cheap solar panels on their thatch roofs and power their laptops and, more often mobile phones. So, I mean, for all of us, it is an energy transition, but one envisages one day there'll be electric motors for the banana boats between islands in the Pacific. But yeah, it's a transition that we're all, I could talk about that for too long, I might stop.
Jeremy.
Jeremy Webb. Notwithstanding the appalling quasi-skeptic policies of the past opposition governments, in reality our climate change policies haven't changed a lot if you look at through the perspective of Scope 3 emissions. So we are increasing our mining and export of gas. So to what extent do the Pacific Island countries understand that our policies in reality haven't changed a lot? And how do they view this idea of a 2026 co-sponsorship when Australia will be flooding the world with gas as usual and raising the sea levels inevitably?
So I had a picture there of then President Anote Tong from Kiribati, and he's now ex-president, but he was in Canberra last week, and he was on Radio National last week talking about exactly this, that it's great to see Australia implementing domestic policy to reduce emissions, but Australia continues to be variously second, third, world largest exporter of coal and gas. And it is a challenge for the Australian government. The Japanese ambassador to Australia yesterday was in Perth presenting alongside Woodside and the Australian gas lobby, talking about how important Australian gas is for Japan's energy security. And Australia and Japan, Chris Bowen, when he went to the UN climate talks last year, he said, look, we're a major fossil fuel exporter. We need to work with major fossil fuel importers together on the energy transition. And I think that's right, that Australia needs to work with countries like Japan, who is our biggest customer for fossil fuels, on the energy transition, and continue to have that discussion as a centrepiece of the relationship. So Madeleine King, our resources minister, she went to Tokyo this year, yes, to reassure them that we would sell them gas for a long time. But interestingly, she also took a prospectus of 200 investment-ready critical minerals projects in Australia, and the prospectus was in Japanese. And the hope is, I mean, maybe it's somewhat forlorn hope, that Australia will shift over time to be a clean energy superpower and not just a fossil fuel heavyweight. That Australia has the resources that countries like Japan needs to decarbonise their economy. So we could make green iron here, for example, and that we have the critical minerals that are needed in wind, solar, batteries, etc.
Next question.
Thanks. Isn't Australia's solution to the Pacific is if we have rising ocean, don't worry, just migrate all to Australia? I mean, that sort of cynical approach. You don't talk very much about the geopolitics of it. AUKUS bringing nuclear power to the Pacific. I mean, isn't that a contradiction? And how does our Pacific partner see that? And also recently, the hoo-ha with China, whose influence it is. These are all going to play up in relation to the climate wars, which is more important to see whether the US has never been interested in this part of the world, but because China is coming, only show that kind of interest. Any linkage to the climate change?
There's a lot going on there. But yeah, it is a tricky line that Australia walks, talking to the Pacific about migration with dignity. So working with Pacific nations that are sadly having to think about and plan for migration, countries like Tuvalu, Kiribati, but also showing that Australia is doing more to ensure that Pacific states don't lose their territorial integrity and ultimately potentially their sovereignty. So I don't think it is a solution, even for Australia's pursuit of strategic interests in the region, just to take them, as it were, and not act on climate change.
Any further questions at this point?
Thank you. All the discussion so far has been about keeping temperatures to less than 1.5 degrees and lowering emissions, quite rightly too. But we've hit 1.5 degrees this year, or this past year, and we're well on our way to 2. And it seems to me some of this discussion needs to be talking about how adaptation is going to occur, and in more sophisticated ways than just migration to Australia and jobs. Is there anything like that going on seriously?
Yeah, I mean, it's true that, and globally the discussion started to talk about adaptation in the multilateral talks in the early 2000s when there was stalled action on emissions, but you know, we've been pretty slow in Australia. This federal government has just announced they're doing consulting right now for the first national adaptation plan for Australia, because you know that's not just for the Pacific. That's for if you're Lismore, if you're parts of Sydney, if you're the Blue Mountains. How do you adapt for our present that has more frequent dangerous fire weather, that has rain events that are unprecedented and flooding? We're behind the 8 ball in terms of helping communities to understand what they now face and to be prepared for minimising harm. So adaptation is absolutely part of, and it probably will be part of the international relations in the region as well. We've seen interesting examples of that. The Fiji military coming to help after, at Malakuta after the bushfires, and I don't think it was planned, but there was actually Fijian workers in Lismore at the meat works that helped to move people, elderly Australians, from the floods from a nursing home in Lismore. Sorry, a little bit off point, but you're absolutely right that we're at the point where we need to get much more serious about adaptation at the same time as we get on with the energy transition.
Next question.
I guess, given it's a probability of about 50%, how would a Trump, incoming Trump administration affect our efforts in the Pacific?
Sorry, how would an incoming Trump administration impact on
Our efforts in the Pacific.
our efforts in the Pacific? Well, there have been studies that have tried to quantify what a second Trump administration would mean for global action on climate change and try and put numbers on that, and would undo all of the global action of the last 6 years in terms of quantifying a number, but it would be very challenging. What I would say is that globally, Trump withdrew, or was in the process of withdrawing the US from the Paris Agreement when he was in power last time, and no one else followed. So no other nations started the process of leaving the Paris Agreement. And I think that speaks to the power of multilateral regimes like the Paris Agreement. It's always up for debate. How powerful is the UN? How powerful are these multilateral processes that are lowest common denominator processes? But you actually see really strong normative commitment by countries to the idea that we need to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, which is essentially what the Paris Agreement requires. If we're going to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, we probably will go past 1.5 in the next few years. But so one would hope that the multilateral regime established through 30 years of climate negotiations can withstand Trump. There's no doubt that it would be a really big challenge, but I would expect, perhaps countries would pedal slowly for a little bit, potentially including Australia. In 2017, Pacific Islands Forum leaders called on the US to return to the Paris Agreement, as Trump was, they sort of wanted to issue not quite a condemnation, but telling the US that it should return to Paris. Interestingly, Australia refused to put its name to that. So it ended up being only the Forum Island countries called on the US to return to Paris. I think that's Australia's concerns about the alliance relationship, trumped Australia's concerns about Trump, or trumped Australia's concerns about climate change. Yeah.
How are we going? Further questions?
Sorry, I think we covered maybe too much ground.
It's a topic most of us grapple with rather than having strong opinions on. And I think there's been an element of scepticism in the room, really, about advances being made very much. It's all been so slow so far. Are you such an optimist as all that?
So we are very close to a global peak in emissions. So the International Energy Agency expects that global demand for coal, oil and gas will peak before 2030. We're very close to that. And the reason why they know that is because we're past the peak in key fossil technologies. So the world is now producing less internal combustion engines, so cars that run on fossil fuels, than we were previously. The world has less coal-fired power plants now than we had previously. Most rich nations, emissions are coming down. In the UK, emissions from coal are lower than they've been for 200 years. And so there is a story if you can keep your eyes on that global picture. So there is a story of despair, don't get me wrong. We are very much in danger of pushing the Earth system past tipping points. We're in danger of going through one-way doors that you can't come back through and tipping the whole Earth system into a new place that will be very dangerous. So there's reasons for despair, but there are definitely reasons for hope. The global clean energy transition is happening. Countries like China, somewhat ironically, is ironic because for so long the discussion has been, why should we act on climate because China has so much coal and coal-fired power. And China is the world's biggest coal user, but China is by a long way the world's biggest producer of clean energy technologies now. So solar, wind, batteries, they have in fact control of the supply chain for some of these clean energy technologies. Sorry, I'm rambling a little, but it is important to know that we have all the technology we need now to move away from coal, oil and gas in our electricity, in our heating, in our cooking, in our cars, and now it is a matter of time before that happens, and the energy transition is happening. So I'm definitely an optimist. I think that global norm and changes, but there's going to be an awful lot of politics, domestic politics and international relations. Our relationship with Japan, our gas exports, all of these things are going to be very big questions.
To say nothing of internal politics.
Yeah, exactly so. But it's not to say that it's not happening, though. It definitely is. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, let me just mention that the next event here at Glover Cottages will be in 2 weeks' time, on Tuesday the 9th of April, when our interns are going to debate the proposition that the defence of Ukraine is the defence of democracies everywhere. So do come along and see what they make of that. But to finish off our event this evening, I'd like to invite one of our interns, Jacob Barry, to move a vote of thanks.
Tonight we've had a very distinguished Australian as our speaker, Dr Wesley Morgan, who is a senior researcher of the Climate Council, a research fellow at the Griffith Asia Institute, and has a PhD in international relations from the University of Melbourne. His account of Australia's attitude towards climate policy leadership has open insight into policy blind spots and diplomatic isolation, and has opened up some somewhat heated questions from the audience. The point that I took the most of going back towards your presentation was that climate change to them, referring to Pacific Island nations, is no less of a threat as to Western countries' guns and bombs are. I think that's a very interesting take. I think that's very good that you said that. And I move that we express our thanks to Dr. Morgan through a round of applause.